Well, Mozambique is not the only African country desperately looking at the IMF for some financial assistance, especially in the wake of economic hardships resulting from the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. But just how bad is the situation for African countries, and how does the global financial institution plan to assist? Let's find out from IMF resident representative in South Africa, Max Alia, who joins me now from Johannesburg. Max, a very good evening. Thank you for speaking to us. I suppose the first question to find out is, there is talk from Ukraine, certainly, that growth global prospects are down 1%. What is the impact on Africa, though?
Good evening, Hugo. These are some difficult times. As soon as the world and Sub-Saharan Africa in particular was getting over the consequences of the COVID pandemic, which had been devastating for many countries, not only on the human part and death, but also economically. Now there is this new significant shock. And, the war in Ukraine has led to very significant increase in prices of commodities, especially on oil prices and fuels and food prices. Although most of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa do not have direct trade links with Russia and Ukraine, in terms of direct trade, the fact is the commodity price increases do affect all of them, because it doesn't really matter whether you buy the wheat or the maize or the sunflower oil or the fuel from Russia or from Ukraine, the global prices are increasing. And this is the main transmission channel to the continent.
Now, the UN's trading and development body says emerging markets, in particular, need packages to survive the economic challenges that they're facing right now. Put into context for us, what would happen if many of these nations on the African continent do not receive support from an organization such as the IMF?
Well, I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is Sub-Saharan Africa is very heterogeneous. Not all the countries are the same. We have about 45 countries in what is known as Sub-Saharan Africa. 10 of these countries are oil exporters, and about 35 of them are oil importers. Those countries that, for example, are oil exporters are likely to benefit because of the increase in fuel prices and oil prices. So for these countries, sort of that dilemma is, of course, you have this windfall that is taking place, so how much of it to save and how much of it to spend? Now, you have the other set of countries, which is a larger set of countries who are fuel importers and also some of them even food importers. For these countries, this cannot come at a worst possible time. Now, the higher commodity prices will affect these countries on two fronts. It will affect them on their balance of payments. They're likely to face wider current account deficits. Also, their public finances are likely to suffer. But this happens at a time when these countries have what we call, economists, a limited fiscal space. And what does it mean? What it means is that public debt has increased significantly over the last few years, so they do not have much room to implement tax or revenue or expenditure measures to really offset the macroeconomic impact. So these countries do really have a very limited room to maneuver this shock. So one impact is really, you can say, on the balance of payments of the budget, but also as commodity price increases, fuel price increases, food price increases, these do have an impact on inflation. And, this is a region of the world where about 40% of the average consumption basket is food. So as food price increases, they do have a very strong hit. They hit very hard families' budgets and families' capacity to consume.
Well, obviously, many of these countries are already heavily indebted to the IMF, so I'd assume that there is little to no appetite by the IMF to extend further loans. And how do you see these countries coming out of this quagmire that they find themselves in?
Well, first of all, I would say the debt that these countries have accumulated over the last few years is not just the IMF. They have accumulated debt with several international organizations. They have accumulated several debt with bilateral development partners. And some of them, though, who have market access, have also accumulated significant debt with the markets because they have issued Eurobonds and access, that kind. So it's not just a significant amount of debt with the IMF. It's debt with a number of creditors. And they were already in a, let's say, difficult situation before even this war happened. Now, we at the IMF, whenever we receive requests for support from any member country, we do assess the merits of the request, and we do assess the policies that these countries propose to address these issues that led them to run into the difficulties. So I don't think that the doors are open to any of these countries, but we are very conscious and we understand that the difficulties and how many of these external shocks, which were out of their control, like COVID, for example, is something that was not under their control, or, for example, the war in Ukraine is not something under their control. So we keep in mind all these elements. And our role here is, A, to provide policy advice based on our experience in different parts of the world, and in as much as possible to provide the financial support to mitigate the adjustment costs.
Now, one of the things that the IMF and certainly other organizations that's similar has been accused of is perpetuating the debt of these poor African countries. Now, looking at your website, some of the things that you propose to do rather is facilitate international trade, promote high employment and sustainable economic growth, and reduce poverty around the world. There's a lot of poverty on the African continent. What are some of your success stories on the African continent, particularly when we talk about sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, there is indeed a massive challenge, honestly, I think worldwide, but in sub-Saharan Africa, about addressing poverty and perhaps even more significantly, the increased inequality that has taken place all over the world. Our advice is always focused on, first of all, maintain macroeconomic stability. Macroeconomic stability is not going to guarantee you success in addressing these issues. However, it is not a sufficient condition, it is a necessary condition. I don't know, honestly, of any country that has succeeded in implementing sustained reductions in poverty and inequality that have done it in the context of macroeconomic instability with high inflation, debt defaults, sharp devaluations. So this is necessary. It may not be sufficient, but it's a necessary condition. However, as you as someone who follows the IMF work, you may have known over the last few years, we have increasingly focused on issues beyond the traditional macro policies, because we clearly understand that, as I said before, just the macro policies are not sufficient, although they are necessary. We have different countries around the world, and in sub-Saharan Africa, countries that have made some progress on this front, but we're coming out of a period that is very interesting. If you take the last 10 years, the world economy, not just the region, the world economy has gone through severe shocks. We had the global financial crisis, we have had COVID, now we're having this war. And in that context, the main objective is obviously mitigate the damage that is done. So, as I said, the countries that are oil exporters, they have a windfall. They need to strike a balance between how much to save and how much to use to support the populations. Those that are importers are likely to have less room to do that, but they need to reprioritize their expenditure and direct it to support the neediest people. And also, it's very important to implement the structural policies which are conducive to attract private investment and generate, foster growth and generate jobs. because these are the policies that in the long term will address all these challenges that you were mentioning.
Now, Max, can you unpack for us just how much is owed by sub-Saharan Africa to the IMF?
Well, I don't have that number for the continent right now handy at the moment. But certainly we are, compared to the overall debt of the region, we are relatively a minor creditor. As I said before, the continent and most countries, not only what they owe to the IMF, which honestly is not the largest fraction, there are other IFIs, but there are very significant debt to bilateral donors, some of them the traditional donors, and some of them new donors, or development partners, as you may want to call them. And there are also some of those countries that have market access do have significant debts to private investors in the form either from bank loans or Eurobonds. But if you take the whole pie, I cannot give you a number because honestly I don't have it handy. The IMF share of all these debt obligations is relatively small.
Max, finally, just a look at countries like Nigeria, Angola, some of the countries that you talked about that are oil-producing nations that currently have to import petroleum to sell to their citizens. What are some of the conversations that you have with countries that have huge amounts of natural resources but are not beneficiating those resources within their own countries?
Well, you see, for these countries, as I mentioned before, this is a windfall so far. To a large extent, hopefully this war is over, and hopefully all the implications with that, I think, for many reasons, this is over. However, no, these countries who are oil exporters are receiving a windfall. So they need to make the decision between how much to save, how much to spend. And when it comes to the decision of how much to spend, because this windfall is likely to be temporary. So whatever is spent is hopefully done in temporary spending to support the population in the context of this shock. And it should not result in spending that create permanent obligations over time. Because if and when these commodity prices go down, in particular oil prices, these countries do not want to see and find themselves in a situation where they have committed to spend certain amounts of money and they cannot honor their commitments going forward. So it's okay to spend some of this money in supporting people to overcome the impact of the shock, but it should be well designed in a way that you do not make permanent spending commitments that eventually you may have troubles honoring going forward.
Max Early is the IMF resident representative in South Africa. We thank you for your time.